Sometimes the most extraordinary acts of courage happen when nobody's watching, when there are no orders to follow, and when breaking the rules becomes the only way to save lives. What would you do if you saw a mission failing, people dying, and the only solution required you to disobey direct orders and risk everything you'd worked for? This is the story of Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, a naval communications officer who wasn't supposed to be a hero. She was supposed to follow protocol, stay at her post, and wait for orders that never came. Instead, she made a decision that would either save dozens of lives or end her military career forever. In the chaos of a rescue operation gone wrong, with a hijacked cargo ship full of hostages and a storm closing in, Sarah did something that no one expected. She acted on her own. What happened next would be talked about in military academies for years to come, not because it was by the book, but because sometimes the book is wrong. This is her story. A story of split-second decisions, incredible courage, and the thin line between heroism and insubordination. The communication center aboard the USS Vigilant hummed with the constant chatter of radio frequencies and the soft glow of multiple monitors. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez adjusted her headset for the 100th time that morning, her brown eyes scanning the various displays showing weather patterns, ship positions, and radio traffic across the South Pacific. At 28, she had been in the Navy for 6 years, long enough to recognize when something was building on the horizon, and today felt different. Sarah had grown up in a small fishing town in Maine, where reading the weather was a matter of survival. Her father, a lobster fisherman, had taught her to watch for the subtle signs that others missed. The way clouds gathered, how the wind shifted, the behavior of seabirds. Those same instincts served her well in the Navy, where she had earned a reputation for being able to sense trouble before it appeared on any radar screen. The morning briefing had been routine. Captain Reynolds, a stern man with silver hair and 30 years of naval experience, had outlined their current mission: provide communication support for a joint training exercise with the Australian Navy. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. Sarah and her team of 4 other communication specialists would monitor radio traffic, relay messages, and ensure all participating ships maintained contact. Standard procedure for a routine operation. But as Sarah monitored the frequencies, something nagged at her. The civilian shipping traffic in their area seemed unusually heavy for this time of year. Cargo vessels, fishing boats, and pleasure craft all seemed to be converging on their operational area. More concerning was the intermittent radio chatter she was picking up on emergency frequencies, brief coded messages that didn't match any standard maritime protocols she knew. Petty Officer Jenkins, a young man fresh out of communication school, noticed her concentration. "Something wrong, Lieutenant?" Sarah held up a hand, listening intently to her headset. There it was again. A quick burst transmission on 121.5 MHz, the international emergency frequency. The message was in English, but heavily accented, and included what sounded like coordinates. She quickly plotted them on her chart. The position was roughly 200 nautical miles southeast of their current location, in international waters. "Jenkins, pull up the shipping manifest for this grid," she ordered, pointing to a chart. "I want to know what commercial traffic is supposed to be in that area." As Jenkins worked at his terminal, Sarah continued monitoring the emergency frequency. The messages were becoming more frequent, and she was beginning to detect a pattern. They always came in pairs, a short burst, followed by a longer transmission 30 seconds later. Someone was clearly trying to communicate covertly, using a frequency they probably assumed wasn't being monitored this far out at sea. "Lieutenant, I've got the shipping data," Jenkins reported. "There are 3 vessels that filed transit plans through that area. 2 container ships, the Pacific Wanderer and the Coastal Dream, and 1 cargo vessel called the Morning Star." Sarah pulled up the information on her screen. The Morning Star caught her attention immediately. It was a mid-sized cargo ship, registered in Panama but operated by a company she didn't recognize. More interesting was its cargo manifest, listed as general freight and humanitarian supplies. That was unusually vague for a commercial vessel. She was about to investigate further when the radio crackled with a transmission that made her blood run cold. This time, the message was clear, spoken in accented but understandable English. "Phoenix Base, this is Falcon 1. Package is secure. Repeat, package is secure. Requesting immediate extraction." Sarah's training kicked in instantly. Package was military slang for hostages or high-value prisoners. Extraction meant someone wanted to be picked up quickly. This wasn't training exercise chatter. This sounded like a real operation, possibly involving kidnapping or piracy. She immediately switched to the ship's internal communication system. "Bridge, this is communications. I need to speak with the captain immediately." "Stand by, communications," came the reply from the bridge. While she waited, Sarah continued monitoring the frequency. The next transmission confirmed her worst fears. "Phoenix Base, we have 37 packages. Requesting immediate extraction to secondary location. Weather window closing fast. 37 people. Someone was holding 37 people hostage, and they wanted to move them before the weather got worse." Sarah looked at her meteorological display. A major storm system was indeed moving into the area. Winds were expected to reach 50 knots by evening, with 12-foot seas. Captain Reynolds' voice finally came through her headset. "What do you have, Martinez?" Sarah quickly briefed him on the radio intercepts and her analysis. She could hear the concern in his voice when she finished. "Are you certain these aren't part of the training exercise?"
Negative, sir.
"I've checked all the exercise frequencies and protocols. These transmissions are definitely outside the scope of our current mission." There was a long pause. "Very well. Continue monitoring and document everything. I'm contacting Fleet Command for guidance." For the next 2 hours, Sarah and her team intercepted increasingly urgent communications. It became clear that whoever was holding the hostages was getting nervous about the approaching storm. The weather was deteriorating faster than predicted, and the extraction they were expecting wasn't going to happen on schedule. Then came the transmission that changed everything. "Phoenix Base, this is Falcon 1. Local authorities are closing in. We need immediate extraction or we implement final option. Repeat, final option in 30 minutes. Sarah's blood went cold. In her experience, final option usually meant eliminating witnesses. These people weren't just planning to escape. They were preparing to kill 37 innocent people. She immediately contacted the bridge again. "Captain, we have an urgent development." This time, Captain Reynolds came down to the communication center personally. Sarah played back the recorded transmissions and showed him her analysis. The captain's face grew grave as he listened. "Have we heard back from Fleet Command?" Sarah asked. "Negative. The storm is interfering with long-range communications. We can't reach them reliably until this weather passes." Sarah stared at the chart showing the location of the suspected hostage situation. At their current speed, the Vigilant could reach the area in 6 hours, but the hostages might not have 6 hours. The storm would also make any rescue operation extremely dangerous, if not impossible. "Sir, what are our orders?" Captain Reynolds looked out the porthole at the darkening sky. "Our orders are to continue with the training exercise and maintain communication support. We are not authorized to deviate from our mission without direct orders from Fleet Command. But, sir, 37 people could die. Lieutenant Martinez, I understand your concern, but we cannot abandon our current mission based on radio intercepts of unknown origin. For all we know, this could be some kind of elaborate hoax or even a training scenario for another unit." Sarah wanted to argue, but she knew the captain was right to be cautious. Military protocol existed for good reasons, and abandoning a mission without proper authorization could have serious consequences. But as she returned to her station and continued monitoring the frequencies, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were the only ones in position to help. The afternoon wore on, and the radio traffic became more desperate. Sarah could hear the fear in the voices now, even through the static and interference from the approaching storm. At 1400, she intercepted a transmission that made her decision for her. "Phoenix Base. Local patrol boat spotted. Children are crying. We cannot wait. Final option in 10 minutes. Children." There were children among the hostages. Sarah looked around the communication center. Jenkins was focused on his equipment, monitoring the training exercise frequencies. The other team members were busy with routine tasks. Dan Che focused on the use of Artadenchi. Captain Reynolds was on the bridge, trying to maintain contact with the exercise controllers as the weather deteriorated. She made a decision that would either save lives or destroy her career. Switching to a secure frequency, she quietly began transmitting her own message. But first, she needed more information about that cargo ship. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she accessed the ship's intelligence database. Using her security clearance, she pulled up everything available on the Morning Star. What she found confirmed her worst suspicions. The cargo vessel had been flagged by Interpol 6 months earlier as a suspected human trafficking ship. It had been spotted in several ports known for illegal activities, and its ownership was buried in a maze of shell companies. The ship's captain, Viktor Kozlov, had a criminal record including charges of kidnapping and extortion, though he had never been convicted due to lack of evidence. More disturbing was a recent intelligence report from the Australian Maritime Border Command. 3 weeks ago, a fishing boat had reported seeing the Morning Star anchored near a remote island, with several smaller boats transferring people aboard. The fishing captain described seeing what appeared to be families with children being forced onto the cargo ship at gunpoint. Sarah's heart raced as she cross-referenced the coordinates from the radio intercepts with the Morning Star's last known position. They matched perfectly. The hostages were aboard that ship, and judging from the increasingly panicked radio traffic, their time was running out. She looked up at the ship's chronometer, 14:35 hours. If the final option was being implemented in 10 minutes, she had less than that to make a decision that could save or doom 37 innocent people. The communications center felt suddenly stifling. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat over the hum of the electronics. Jenkins was still focused on his station, completely unaware of the drama unfolding. On the emergency frequencies, the routine training exercise continued around them, while real lives hung in the balance just a few hundred miles away. Sarah thought about her father back in Maine. He had taught her that sometimes you had to trust your instincts, even when everyone else thought you were wrong. The sea doesn't care about your rulebook, Sarah, he used to say. When lives are on the line, you do what's right, not what's easy. She made her choice. Switching to her personal workstation, Sarah began composing a message on the emergency frequency using standard international distress protocols. She kept her voice calm and professional, despite her racing pulse. Morning Star, this is USS Vigilant. We have been monitoring emergency traffic and are responding to reports of persons in distress. Please identify yourself and state the nature of your emergency. The response came immediately, but not from the Morning Star. USS Vigilant, this is Falcon 1. You are ordered to maintain your current heading and course. This is not your concern. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Whoever Falcon 1 was, they knew the Vigilant's name and had been monitoring naval frequencies. This was definitely not a random piracy operation. It was something much more organized and dangerous. But it was too late to back down now. Sarah had already revealed their presence. She switched to a different frequency and tried a new approach. Morning Star, this is the communications officer aboard USS Vigilant. If you are experiencing engine trouble or medical emergencies, we can provide assistance. The weather is deteriorating rapidly and your safety is our primary concern. This time, a different voice responded. Older, more desperate, speaking in heavily accented English. USS Vigilant, this is Captain Rodriguez of the Morning Star. We have a situation. People are in danger. We need help. Sarah's pulse quickened. Captain Rodriguez was clearly not one of the hostage takers. He was probably being forced to communicate, but he was trying to signal for help without alerting his captors. Captain Rodriguez, can you specify the nature of your emergency? Do you require medical evacuation or mechanical assistance? There was a long pause, filled with static from the approaching storm. Finally, Rodriguez's voice came back, barely audible. We have cargo problems. 37 units in poor condition. Some are very young. The cargo handlers they are not following proper procedures. Sarah's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to remain professional. Rodriguez was clearly describing the hostages in coded language, trying to communicate their situation without alerting the criminals who were undoubtedly listening to every word. Captain Rodriguez, we understand. Can you maintain your current position until assistance arrives? Negative, Vigilant. The cargo handlers insist we must dispose of damaged units within minutes. They say it is company policy. Sarah closed her eyes. The man was telling her that the hostage takers were about to start killing people, and there was nothing subtle about it. She had to act now. But as she reached for her transmit button, a hand fell on her shoulder. Captain Reynolds was standing behind her, his face a mixture of anger and concern. Lieutenant Martinez, what exactly are you doing? Sarah turned to face her commanding officer, knowing that her career was probably over regardless of what happened next. Sir, I'm trying to save 37 lives. By disobeying direct orders and revealing our position to unknown hostile forces. Sir, with respect, there are children on that ship. They're going to be murdered if we don't act. Captain Reynolds studied her face for a long moment, then looked at the communications equipment displaying the intercepts she had been monitoring. Show me everything you have. For the next 5 minutes, Sarah quickly briefed the captain on everything she had discovered about the Morning Star, the radio intercepts, and her communication with Captain Rodriguez. Reynolds listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each piece of evidence. When she finished, the captain was quiet for nearly a minute. Finally, he spoke. Even if everything you've told me is accurate, we cannot abandon our current mission without proper authorization. The training exercise involves 6 Allied ships and could impact international relations if we simply disappear without explanation. Sir, by the time we get authorization, those people will be dead. That may be true, Lieutenant, but we are military officers. We follow orders even when those orders are difficult to accept. Sarah felt her frustration building. What about our oath to protect innocent lives? Our oath is to follow the orders of our superiors and serve our country's interests. We are not authorized to conduct independent rescue operations in international waters. The radio crackled with another transmission from the Morning Star. Vigilant, this is Rodriguez. The cargo handlers are becoming impatient. They are beginning to inspect the damaged units more closely. Sarah looked at Captain Reynolds pleadingly. Sir, please. Reynolds stared out the porthole at the darkening sky and rough seas. When he turned back to Sarah, there was resignation in his voice. Lieutenant, you are hereby ordered to cease all unauthorized communications and return to monitoring the training exercise frequencies. Yes, sir, Sarah replied, but her mind was already working on another plan. As Captain Reynolds left the communication center, Sarah sat at a station, staring at the radio equipment. She had been given a direct order, but she also knew that 37 innocent people were about to die while she followed protocol. She thought about her younger sister back home, who was the same age as some of the children reportedly aboard the Morning Star. She thought about her father's words, about doing what's right instead of what's easy. Most importantly, she thought about living with herself if she did nothing, and read about the massacre in tomorrow's news reports. At 14:47 hours, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She was going to disobey a direct order from her commanding officer. But first, she needed to know exactly where the Morning Star was located, and she needed a way to reach them without the USS Vigilant. Sarah had an idea, but it was incredibly dangerous and would require her to act completely on her own. She looked around the communication center one more time. Jenkins and the other operators were still focused on their routine duties, monitoring the training exercise and weather reports. None of them knew what was happening on the emergency frequencies. Sarah took a deep breath and began implementing her plan. She would save those hostages, even if it meant sacrificing everything she had worked for. Some things were more important than following orders. Sarah's plan was born of desperation and shaped by her intimate knowledge of the USS Vigilant's capabilities. Every naval communications officer knew that their ship carried a small complement of rigid inflatable boats, or RIBs, for emergency situations and boarding operations. These fast, maneuverable craft could operate in rough seas and cover long distances quickly. If she could somehow access one of the RIBs without authorization, she might be able to reach the Morning Star before the hostage-takers carried out their threats. The first challenge was getting accurate coordinates for the Morning Star's position. Sarah had approximate coordinates from the radio intercepts, but she needed precise location data to navigate in the deteriorating weather conditions. Using her access to the ship's radar and satellite communication systems, she began triangulating the source of the radio transmissions. The process required her to work quickly and quietly while maintaining her normal duties. Every few minutes, she had to switch back to monitoring the training exercise frequencies to avoid suspicion from Jenkins and the other operators. Her heart raced as she worked, knowing that every passing minute brought the hostages closer to disaster. At 14:52 hours, she finally had what she needed. The Morning Star was located approximately 180 nautical miles southeast of their current position, anchored near a small, uninhabited island that didn't appear on most maritime charts. The radio signals were coming from that exact location, and satellite imagery showed a single large vessel matching the Morning Star's profile. Now came the more difficult part of her plan. Sarah needed to leave her post without being detected and somehow gain access to one of the ship's RIBs. She had never attempted anything like this before, but her knowledge of the Vigilant's layout and standard operating procedures gave her a chance. Sarah waited until the next watch rotation at 1500 hours. During shift changes, there was always a brief period of confusion as personnel moved between stations and new operators took over equipment. She used this opportunity to slip away from the communication center, telling Jenkins she was going to the head and would be back in a few minutes. Instead of heading to the bathroom, Sarah made her way down to the ship's lower decks, where the RIBs were stored. The route took her through several sections of the ship, and she had to be careful to avoid areas where she might encounter senior officers or security personnel. Her communications officer uniform gave her access to most parts of the ship, but being in the wrong place at the wrong time would raise questions she couldn't answer. The RIB storage area was located on the port side of the ship, accessed through a hatch that led to a small platform just above the waterline. Sarah knew from her training that each RIB was equipped with an outboard motor, emergency supplies, and basic navigation equipment. What she hoped to find was a portable radio, powerful enough to communicate with both the Morning Star and the USS Vigilant. As she approached the storage area, Sarah's luck almost ran out. Chief Petty Officer Williams, the ship's senior boatswain, was conducting a routine inspection of the safety equipment. Sarah quickly ducked behind a bulkhead and waited for him to finish. Her absence from the communication center was already stretching beyond what could be explained by a bathroom break. Finally, Chief Williams completed his inspection and moved on to another section of the ship. Sarah quickly accessed the rib storage area and began her desperate preparations. The first boat she checked was perfect for her needs, a 7-meter IRI with a powerful outboard motor and a full complement of survival gear. More importantly, it was equipped with a portable VHF radio and GPS navigation system. The physical challenge of launching a rib alone was significant. These boats were designed to be deployed by a trained crew, and Sarah had to figure out how to manage the launch system by herself. The approaching storm made everything more difficult, as the ship was beginning to roll heavily in the increasing swells. As she worked to prepare the RIB for launch, Sarah's radio crackled with a transmission from the Morning Star that made her hand shake.
Phoenix Base, this is Falcon 1.
Local authorities approaching faster than expected. Implementing final option now. Repeat. Implementing final option immediately. Sarah's blood turned to ice. The hostage takers were starting to kill people right now, while she was still struggling to launch her rescue attempt. She abandoned her careful preparations and began frantically working the boat launch controls. The RIB hit the water with a jarring impact that nearly threw Sarah overboard. The small boat immediately began pitching violently in the rough seas, and she had to fight to maintain control as she tried to start the outboard motor. Her hands were wet from spray and shaking from adrenaline, making it difficult to operate the engine controls. After 3 failed attempts, the motor finally roared to life. Sarah immediately pushed the throttle forward and began racing toward the coordinates she had memorized. The GPS showed 180 nautical miles to a destination at the RIB's maximum speed. She could cover that distance in about 3 hours, assuming the weather didn't get worse. But the weather was definitely getting worse. The storm that had been approaching all day was now fully upon them, with wind gusts reaching 40 knots and seas building to 8 feet. The small RIB was being thrown around like a toy, and Sarah had to constantly adjust her course to avoid being swamped by the larger waves. 20 minutes into her journey, Sarah's radio came alive with transmissions from the USS Vigilant. Captain Reynolds had discovered her absence, and the entire ship was being turned upside down looking for her. All stations, this is the captain. We have a missing crew member. Lieutenant Martinez has left her post without authorization and is not responding to calls. Security teams conduct a complete sweep of the ship immediately. Sarah turned down the volume on her radio but continued listening. She knew that her absence would be discovered quickly, but she had hoped for more time before the search began. Now the captain would realize what she had done, and there would probably be other ships dispatched to bring her back. But there was no turning back now. Even if she wanted to return to the Vigilant, she was already too far away in increasingly dangerous conditions. Her only choice was to continue toward the Morning Star and hope she could reach the hostages before it was too late. The next hour was a nightmare of battling mountainous waves and driving rain. Several times, Sarah thought the RIB would be overwhelmed by the conditions, but somehow she managed to keep the boat moving forward. Her navigation equipment showed she was making steady progress toward her destination, but at a much slower speed than she had hoped. At 16:30 hours, she intercepted a radio transmission that gave her hope. Captain Rodriguez's voice came through the static. "Vigilant, if you are still listening, the cargo handlers have been delayed by equipment problems. But they say the delay will not be long. Please, if you can help us, we need assistance very soon." Sarah immediately responded. "Captain Rodriguez, this is Lieutenant Martinez from the Vigilant. I am en route to your position. Can you provide more specific information about your situation?" The relief in Rodriguez's voice was obvious. "Lieutenant Martinez, thank God. We have 37 passengers, including 12 children, being held by 6 armed men. They have explosive devices and say they will sink the ship if any military vessels approach." "Understood, Captain. I am not in a military vessel. I am approaching in a small boat and will attempt to board your ship. Can you tell me the best way to get aboard without being detected?" There was a long pause before Rodriguez responded. "Lieutenant, that is very dangerous. These men are professionals, and they will kill you if they discover you." "Captain, with respect, they're going to kill everyone anyway if we don't do something. I need to know how to get aboard your ship. After another pause, Rodriguez came back with detailed information about the Morning Star's layout. The ship had a small cargo door on the starboard side, about 10 feet above the waterline, that was used for loading smaller items.
If Sarah could somehow climb up to that door, she might be able to get inside the ship without being seen by the hostage takers, who were apparently concentrated on the bridge and in the main cargo holds. But first, she had to survive the remaining 2 hours of her journey through the worst storm she had ever experienced. The storm had transformed from a threatening presence on the horizon into a living monster that seemed determined to destroy Sarah and her small boat. Waves now regularly reached 12 feet, and the wind was howling at nearly 60 knots. The RIB would climb up the face of each massive wave, hover momentarily at the crest, then crash down into the trough with bone-jarring impact. Sarah had long since abandoned any attempt at comfort or safety. She was strapped into the pilot's seat, soaked to the skin despite her rain gear, and fighting to keep the boat pointed in the right direction. The GPS showed she had covered about 2/3 of the distance to the Morning Star, but her progress was slowing as the conditions worsened. At 17:15 hours, disaster nearly struck when a particularly large wave caught the RIB sideways and nearly flipped it completely over. Sarah found herself hanging upside down in her safety harness for several terrifying seconds before the boat righted itself. When she looked at her instruments, she discovered that the impact had damaged her GPS display. She could still navigate by compass, but she had lost her precise positioning information. Even worse, seawater had gotten into the radio compartment, and her communications equipment was beginning to malfunction. The radio would work intermittently, but she was losing the ability to stay in contact with Captain Rodriguez aboard the Morning Star. Sarah forced herself to stay calm and assess her situation. She was alone in a small boat in the middle of a major storm with damaged navigation equipment, heading toward a confrontation with armed criminals. By any rational measure, her mission was already doomed. But she kept thinking about the 12 children aboard the Morning Star and what would happen to them if she turned back now. At 17:30 hours, she caught a brief glimpse of lights through the driving rain and spray. According to her compass heading, she was approaching the coordinates where the Morning Star should be anchored. Sarah reduced her speed and began looking for a way to approach the cargo ship without being detected. The Morning Star was indeed anchored near a small, rocky island that provided some shelter from the worst of the storm. The ship was much larger than Sarah had expected, probably 400 feet long, with multiple cargo holds, and a superstructure that rose 5 stories above the waterline. Getting aboard would be far more difficult than she had imagined. As she circled the ship at a distance, trying to identify the best approach route, Sarah's radio crackled with a weak transmission from Captain Rodriguez. "Lieutenant Martinez, where are you? The cargo handlers are becoming very impatient. They say the delay ends in 30 minutes. Sarah keyed her radio, hoping the transmission would get through. "Captain Rodriguez, I can see your ship. I'm going to attempt to board on the starboard side. Can you create some kind of distraction to draw the guards away from that area?" "I will try, but please be very careful. These men have already killed 2 crew members who tried to resist." The knowledge that people had already died made Sarah even more determined. She studied the starboard side of the Morning Star, looking for the cargo door that Rodriguez had described. The door was there, but it was much higher above the waterline than she had expected. In calm conditions, it would have been a challenging climb. In the current storm, it looked nearly impossible. Sarah maneuvered her IRIB as close to the ship as she dared. The 2 vessels were rising and falling independently in the swells, creating a dangerous situation where the small boat could be crushed against the larger ship's hull. She had to time her approach perfectly to have any chance of success. At 17:45 hours, she made her move. As a large wave lifted the RIB toward the level of the cargo door, Sarah leaped from her boat and grabbed for a rope ladder that hung from the ship's side. Her first attempt failed, and she fell back into the RIB, nearly being thrown overboard by the impact. On her second attempt, she managed to grab the ladder, but immediately realized how difficult the climb would be. The ship was rolling heavily in the storm, and the ladder was swinging wildly from side to side. Each time she tried to climb higher, another wave would slam into the ship and threaten to tear her grip loose. Halfway up the ladder, Sarah heard voices above her. Someone was shouting in what sounded like Russian or Eastern European language. Had she been discovered? She froze on the ladder, trying to make herself invisible against the ship's dark hull. The voices moved away, and Sarah realized that Captain Rodriguez must have succeeded in creating his distraction. She quickly climbed the remaining distance to the cargo door and found, to her relief, that it was unlocked.
Rodriguez had somehow managed to access this part of the ship and prepare the way for her arrival. Once inside the ship, Sarah found herself in a narrow cargo corridor lined with containers and equipment. The interior of the Morning Star was dimly lit and filled with the sounds of the storm outside and the ship's engines working to maintain position. More concerning were the other sounds she could hear, voices speaking in foreign languages, and what sounded like crying from somewhere deeper in the ship. Sarah checked her equipment. Her radio was still functioning intermittently, and she had a waterproof flashlight and a knife from the RIB's emergency kit. She had no weapons and no backup. But she did have the element of surprise and her knowledge of the ship's layout from Rodriguez's briefing. According to the captain, the hostages were being held in two groups, the adults in the main cargo hold and the children in a smaller compartment near the crew quarters. The armed guards were stationed at strategic points throughout the ship, but most of them were concentrated near the bridge and the main cargo holds. Sarah's plan was simple but dangerous. She would try to reach the children first, since they were the most vulnerable and might be easier to evacuate. If she could get them to safety, she could then work on freeing the adult hostages. But first, she had to move through the ship without being detected. As she made her way through the cargo corridor, Sarah could hear more clearly the sounds of the hostage situation unfolding around her. There were definitely children crying, and she could hear men shouting orders in accented English. Tension in the voices suggested that the hostage-takers were under significant stress, which made them even more dangerous. At 1800 hours, Sarah reached a junction in the corridor where she had to choose between 3 different routes through the ship. According to Rodriguez's description, the children were being held somewhere to her left, but she could hear voices coming from that direction. The route to her right would take her toward the main cargo hold where the adult hostages were located, but it would also bring her closer to where most of the guards were positioned. She was trying to decide which way to go when her radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Captain Rodriguez. "Martinez, they know something is wrong. They're demanding to speak with the USS Vigilant immediately, and they're threatening to start killing hostages if they don't get answers." Sarah realized that her rescue attempt had been discovered, or at least suspected. The hostage-takers knew that someone was trying to help the people aboard the Morning Star, and they were reacting by escalating their threats. She had to move fast now. The element of surprise was gone, and the lives of 37 innocent people depended on what she did in the next few minutes. Sarah made her choice and turned left toward where the children were being held. If she was going to risk everything, she was going to save the most vulnerable victims first. Sarah moved through the narrow corridor, with her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the guards would hear it. Every step took her deeper into the ship and closer to the terrified voices of children who had no idea help was coming. The corridor was dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with every roll of the ship in the storm. As she approached the area where Captain Rodriguez had said the children were being held, Sarah could hear them more clearly. There were definitely young voices crying and calling out in several different languages. Mixed with the children's voices were the harsh commands of at least 2 adult men speaking in heavily accented English. Sarah pressed herself against the bulkhead and carefully peered around a corner. What she saw made her stomach clench with rage and determination. 12 children, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 15, were huddled together in a small cargo compartment. They were dirty, frightened, and several showed signs of injuries. 2 armed men stood guard over them, both carrying assault rifles and looking increasingly agitated as they spoke rapidly into handheld radios. From their radio conversations, Sarah gathered that the hostage-takers were indeed aware that something was wrong. They knew the USS Vigilant was in the area, and they suspected that some kind of rescue attempt was being planned. The guards were receiving orders to prepare for immediate evacuation of the ship, which Sarah knew meant they were planning to eliminate the witnesses and escape. Sarah checked her watch, 18:15 hours. She had been aboard the Morning Star for 30 minutes, and her presence would certainly be discovered soon if it hadn't been already. She had to act now, but she was one person with a knife facing 2 men with automatic weapons. Then she remembered something from her Navy training. During her time at the Naval Academy, she had learned that the most effective weapon in any confrontation was often surprise and confusion, not superior firepower. If she could create enough chaos and uncertainty, she might be able to turn the situation to her advantage. Sarah studied the ship's layout around her. The corridor where she was hiding connected to several other passages, and there was an electrical panel just a few feet away. If she could cause a power failure in this section of the ship, the guards would be temporarily blinded and disoriented. In the confusion, she might be able to free the children and get them to safety.
But first, she needed to communicate with Captain Rodriguez and coordinate her actions with any distraction he could provide. Sarah quietly keyed her radio, hoping the transmission would get through. Captain Rodriguez, this is Martinez. I've located the children. I need you to create the biggest distraction you can in 3 minutes. Can you do that? Rodriguez's voice came back immediately, barely audible through the static. Yes, Lieutenant. I will try to create trouble near the bridge. Be ready to move fast. Sarah looked at her watch again. 3 minutes to prepare, then everything would depend on timing and luck. She made her way to the electrical panel and studied the circuit breakers. Her father's work as a fisherman had required him to understand boat electrical systems, and he had taught Sarah the basics. She identified the circuits that controlled lighting in this section of the ship and prepared to shut them down. At exactly 18:18 hours, Sarah heard the distraction begin. Somewhere toward the front of the ship there was shouting and what sounded like equipment crashing to the deck. Captain Rodriguez was apparently making good on his promise to create chaos. The two guards in the children's compartment immediately began talking rapidly into their radios, and one of them started to move toward the disturbance. Sarah waited until the first guard disappeared around the corner, then she threw the circuit breakers. The corridor immediately plunged into darkness, except for the faint glow of emergency lighting. In the children's compartment, she could hear the remaining guard cursing and fumbling for a flashlight. This was her chance. Sarah burst around the corner into the compartment, shouting in her most authoritative voice, "United States Navy, everyone get down." The remaining guard was completely disoriented by the sudden darkness and Sarah's unexpected appearance. He raised his rifle but couldn't see clearly enough to aim effectively. Sarah threw herself at him, using her momentum and the element of surprise to knock him off balance. They crashed into a stack of cargo containers, and Sarah managed to grab the rifle barrel and point it away from the children. The struggle was brief but violent. The guard was larger and stronger than Sarah, but he was also confused and afraid. When Sarah managed to drive her knee into his solar plexus, he doubled over, gasping for breath. She grabbed his rifle and quickly checked to make sure it was safe. "I'm with the United States Navy," she told the terrified children in English, then repeated it in Spanish when she saw that several of them didn't understand. "I'm here to get you out. We have to move now." The children's response was immediate. Despite their fear and confusion, they recognized that Sarah was there to help them. The oldest child, a girl who appeared to be about 14, quickly began organizing the younger ones and translating Sarah's instructions into what sounded like Portuguese and possibly Tagalog. Sarah zip-tied the unconscious guard with restraints from her emergency kit, then began moving the children toward the corridor. Her plan was to get them to the cargo door where she had entered the ship, then somehow get them down to her IBM. But as they reached the corridor, Sarah realized that her original plan was no longer viable. The first guard was returning, and he was not alone. Sarah could hear at least 3 sets of footsteps approaching, along with shouted commands in the foreign language she had heard earlier. Even worse, she could see flashlight beams moving in their direction. Sarah quickly revised her plan. Instead of trying to reach the cargo door, she would have to find another way off the ship. Captain Rodriguez had mentioned that the Morning Star carried several lifeboats, which would be much safer for the children than trying to get them down a rope ladder to her small RIB. "This way," she whispered to the children, leading them in the opposite direction from the approaching guards. The corridor they entered was completely dark, and Sarah had to use her flashlight to navigate while trying to keep the beam from being seen by the searchers behind them. At 18:25 hours, they reached a stairway that led up to the ship's boat deck where the lifeboats were located. But as they climbed the stairs, Sarah could hear radio chatter from the guards who had discovered their escape. The entire ship was being alerted, and it would only be minutes before they were surrounded. The boat deck was exposed to the full fury of the storm, and Sarah had to hold on to the children to keep them from being blown overboard by the powerful winds. Rain was coming down in torrents, and the deck was slick with spray and seawater. But they had reached the lifeboats. Sarah had never launched a lifeboat under emergency conditions, but she had studied the procedures during her naval training. The process was designed to be simple enough that anyone could operate it during an emergency, but doing it in a major storm, with 12 terrified children and armed men searching for them, added complications she hadn't anticipated. As she worked to prepare the nearest lifeboat for launch, Sarah's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission. It was Captain Reynolds from the USS Vigilant. "Lieutenant Martinez, this is Captain Reynolds. We have been monitoring your radio traffic and are en route to your position. ETA 20 minutes. Can you hold your position until we arrive?" Sarah looked around at the chaos on the boat deck, the frightened children, and the storm that was making everything infinitely more difficult. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. "Negative, Captain."
I have 12 children and the situation is deteriorating rapidly. I'm attempting to evacuate them now. Lieutenant, you are ordered to maintain your position and wait for backup. For a moment, Sarah almost laughed. Even now, facing the most critical situation of her life, military protocol demanded that she wait for proper authorization. But there was no time for protocol now. Sir, with respect, we can't wait. I'm getting these children off the ship now. As if to emphasize her point, the door to the boat deck burst open and two armed men appeared, shouting and pointing weapons in their direction. Sarah pushed the children behind the lifeboat and prepared for what might be her final act as a naval officer. But sometimes, the storm that makes everything more dangerous can also be your salvation. A massive wave, larger than any that had come before, slammed into the Morning Star just as the guards were trying to aim their weapons. The entire ship rolled so far to port that everyone on the deck was thrown off their feet. Sarah used the confusion to complete the lifeboat launch sequence. The boat dropped into the churning sea with the children safely inside, and Sarah jumped in just as another wave lifted them away from the Morning Star. As they were carried away from the cargo ship by the storm, Sarah looked back to see the USS Vigilant approaching through the darkness, its searchlights cutting through the rain and spray. She had done it. She had saved 12 innocent children and somehow survived to tell the story. But her real test would come later, when she had to face the consequences of disobeying direct orders and abandoning her post to conduct an unauthorized rescue operation. The Navy would have to decide whether Sarah Martinez was a hero or a criminal. For now, though, as she held a crying 5-year-old girl and watched the Vigilance rescue boats approaching, Sarah knew she had made the right choice. Some things were more important than following orders, and saving innocent lives was definitely one of them.